So my name is Marjorie Wollicott, and I am a professor of neuroscience in the Institute of Neuroscience at the University of Oregon. And I have been studying near-death experiences and other phenomena related to consciousness and whether it might be actually fundamental to us and not just a product of the neurons in the brain for a number of years. But I should mention that I was trained as a materialist neuroscientist in my graduate days. And I found that though that was intriguing, and I did a lot of work in rehabilitation medicine, helping people with stroke and Parkinson's disease and children with cerebral palsy, for example, gain their balance and strength and walking abilities again. It wasn't as satisfying as I had hoped. And what happened to me is when I was about 30 years old, I had an amazing spiritual awakening experience. And I'll just tell you briefly about it because it really changed my life. I had been invited by my sister to a meditation retreat, and I was intrigued by it, but I was a neuroscientist and I was skeptical, but I decided to attend. And what happened is on the first day of the retreat, the meditation master who was leading the retreat telling us that we would be all initiated. He would be initiating every individual there. And the initiation was described as a spiritual awakening. And it was to happen through this meditation teacher's touch. So I was skeptical, but I was curious, and I decided I was there for the weekend, so why not go ahead and just see what happened? And so what happened is when he came to me, my eyes were closed, but my senses were otherwise fully engaged. So when I felt his fingers touching my bridge of my nose right between the eyes, I had this utter certainty about the event. And when that happened, what I felt was a current which felt like electricity or almost like a mini lightning bolt go from his fingers right from the point between my eyes down into the center of my chest. And I could feel that exact point where it stopped, and I began feeling this place in my heart that felt like this expansion of love and joy that was like permeating my whole being and beyond. And I remember at that moment, what I said to myself is, oh, I'm home. I'm home. My heart is my home. It felt like I finally awakened to something inside of me that was much bigger than what I really knew my own reality to be. Now, what happened after that, I think, was equally phenomenal. I went back home to my university teaching position in Virginia, and the next morning, spontaneously, I got up and I meditated. And I did this day after day after day, and it was because I knew that just beneath the surface of my awareness simmered this quiet ecstasy. And I tapped it once, but I felt it was just waiting for me right underneath that awareness that I was usually in. So that really changed now my way of looking at the world. And I asked this question as a neuroscientist. I said, am I just living in a Newtonian world of cause and effect, and brain is the cause of my consciousness, or is there something more? Is it possible that consciousness could actually be fundamental or primary? And so over the next many years, I began gradually to shift my research to that area. And by the end of my regular career at the university, I was now exploring meditation and I was exploring near-death experiences and other things of that sort. And then I should say that I then decided at that point to write a book to try to put together my understanding of this new awareness. And so I wrote a book titled Infinite Awareness, The Awakening of a Scientific Mind. And in that book, I included a chapter on near-death experiences. I didn't know a lot about them. I began doing research, and then I had this synchronistic experience where I was at a meditation retreat, and I was talking to the woman who was an MD, actually, who was helping to administer the retreat, told her that I was writing this chapter, and she said, oh, by the way, I had a near-death experience. And I was amazed to hear that. And so we decided that after the retreat was over, we would have a beautiful discussion via Zoom on what exactly happened to her so I could include it in my book. And so I just want to tell you maybe briefly about that, if that seems reasonable next. So basically what she said is that this NDE happened when it was during her second pregnancy. She'd had a first pregnancy where she had given birth to two twin boys. They were healthy and wonderful. But when she talked to the doctors as she was now in the second pregnancy, they said this was going to be much more complex. And that was because her placenta was obstructing the birth canal. And that meant that there was going to be a strong risk of bleeding basically as her uterus enlarged. and that could cause risk to both her life and the baby's life. So they decided to do a C-section as soon as the baby was actually mature enough to be able to survive on its own. And so at one point, after they had been doing tests, they said, okay, now the baby is ready, the lungs are mature, and they can go ahead and do it. And she said then what happened is that as they were then beginning to do the C-section surgery, she was in the operating room, and she was sort of joking with the anesthesiologist, trying to be light, even though she knew this was actually going to be a high-risk procedure. And she said then he gives her the IV in a vein, and she loses consciousness. And she says suddenly she is awakened by these words in the operating room. Her blood pressure is too low. And it's her anesthesiologist's alarm voice that snapped her awake, she says, as if from a deep sleep. And she says, suddenly, right in the middle of the operation, she has awakened and she has heightened awareness. She says, the likes of which she's never experienced before. And she says, how wondrous is this super alert state that's basically beyond the reach of the drugs that were bathing her brain. She says, I'm truly awake as if for the first time while under general anesthesia. And she says, just as amazing, she says, I realize how calm I am given the circumstances. She says, there's no fear. She says, I can feel the painless tugging sensations in my abdomen as the surgery is in progress. And she can hear the anesthesiologist anxiously asking the surgeon about her blood loss. The surgeon has a tense answer, she said, which is shocking. He says, the baby is gone. And then right over her right shoulder, she says, bursts out this loud expletive from the anesthesiologist. She says, darn. She says, there's no blood pressure at all. And she says, in the next instant, I feel a profound stillness in the center of my chest. She says, something is missing. Her heart has stopped. And at the same time, she says she can see clearly into the room. She says, how amazing. She says, my eyelids of my physical eyes have been taped shut to protect the corneas. Yet by some other mechanism, I can see perfectly clearly. She says there are bags of blood hanging on the IV pole that are already being transfused. And then suddenly she hears this loud volley of beeps from the cardiac monitor sending out an alarm. And she sees the anesthesiologist spring up from his chair, slam his fist into this large red button on the wall, and summoning the hospital resuscitation team because he believes she's dying. He then flings open these surgical drapes and he begins pumping on her chest with his muscular arms. And she sees then her ghostly pale body flopping up and down. He says, she thinks the worst is happening. She says, oh my goodness, I've lost my baby, I've lost all my blood, and I'm having cardiac arrest. But she says, amazingly, instead of being terrified, she says she's watching the catastrophe from a space of extraordinary equanimity, even as she realizes I'm dying. She says, something in me already knows it's useless to fight, and the only thing to do is to relax and let go. And she says, then the stillness in her chest expands, and she can feel this current of energy drawing her inside. She says, I let go into this flow. She says, I feel like I'm floating deep inside. And then all of the awareness of the room and her body drops away, and she's floating toward an edge, she says, toward this vast emptiness beyond. And she says, then gliding over this invisible threshold, she plunges backward in this graceful backward arc, down and down into nothingness. She says, darkness engulfs her. And then there's nothing. There's no sense of the world or even of her own existence. And then she says there's this feeling of a kaboom, this thunderous sound echoing all around her. And she says suddenly she feels suspended in space, as if she's exploded through this barrier. And then the echoes fade away and she has this experience, I'm free, I'm alive, bodiless, eternal, pure being. And that's who I really am. She says, I've always been so and I always will be so. That was her experience. Then she said there's profound silence, this velvety darkness like the night sky all around her, and an endless expanse of radiant darkness shimmering and mesmerizing. And she says, in all directions without horizon, there is astounding beauty, boundless sparkling light. And this realization dawns. She says, this light is alive. Now, in every direction, this light is looking back with friendly recognition. And she says, I know this shimmering void is supreme reality, and it's made of nothing but consciousness, all knowing, infinite, and pulsating with potentiality. It's the foundation of everything. And she says, with this burst of awe and exhilaration, her focus soars over this vast expanse, delighting in its boundless splendor. Then she experiences this amazing stillness. She says, I'm anchored in a state of perfect repose, absolutely fulfilled, enveloped in this silent, velvety light. And then she hears this voice, you must live. And she says, not in words, but it's a kind of silent thunder. And the message happens again, you must live. But she's wondering, who is this you? And what does it mean to live when I'm already absolutely alive right now? Then something catches her attention and she sees this twinkling light, this tiny jewel that's nestled deep within the darkness. And she focuses on that light. And she sees many, many different facets of a beautiful jewel and the colorful scenes of her whole lifetime on simultaneous display at that moment. It's the entire experience of somebody, she said, who once lived, someone very familiar. And gradually she remembers, I once was a person. And I'm looking at that person's entire experience, past, present, and future, playing out simultaneously, all contained in this point of flickering light. You must live. That command resounded to her again a third time, and she thinks it's clear, I'm meant to return to that life. But how can I possibly do it? She says, and besides, that life is over. How can it possibly be resurrected? Then she says there's an unbroken flow of wordless communication. The knowledge of how I am to return to that life streams into my awareness, she says. I have to be fearless. I have to remain focused on the present moment. I have to have certainty that I'm going to live. She says, in the next instant, there's this tremendous rushing sound accompanied by a rapid swirling and contracting as if the entire expanse of consciousness is twisting into this great vortex and she's funneling downward at tremendous speed. And then just as abruptly, the tumult comes to a complete stop, and suddenly her perception balloons back into the operating room, as if not a moment had passed. And she says from her vantage point now above the scene in the operating room, she feels like she's an open conduit in which that power of consciousness is going to be able to flow. Now, what does she see? She sees the anesthesiologist still pumping on her chest, and the surgeon is toiling away in her blood-filled abdomen. She sees the resuscitation team rushing in, and she sees doctors bursting through the double doors and practically skidding to a stop, wide-eyed and breathless. And now as they take their places all around her body, she feels their minds bracing for the inevitable. They believe she's already gone. And it's true, that body is rocking flaccidly under this anesthesiologist's chest compressions, appearing quite irreversibly dead. She says the skin is ghostly white, and the abdominal cavity exposed by this large midline incision, opened wide by retractors, is sloshing with bright red blood, and there's blood on the floor. She says, I feel Bettina Payton's mind at some lower level churning in fear and anguish, yet managing to fuss about being seen by colleagues in such a condition, stark naked, doesn't seem to be appropriate, so she gives it no attention. And then her own consciousness communicates directly to the team members as they take their places around the table. I'm going to live. You can do this. Now let's get to work. And she says now she feels that energy pulsing through her as she tries to help them make that body live again. She says the whole room is suffused with miraculous light. The room's teeming with personnel. And she says in the center of the action is her surgeon, who is totally focused. Now, amidst that clamor and urgency, working in this lurching surgical field filled with blood, he's performing what he would later say was his first 3-minute hysterectomy. She says her visual standpoint transcends and encompasses this entire scene, but she can also feel the sensations occurring within her corpse-like body below. And although the surgery is excruciatingly painful, there's an intense wrenching and pulling in the abdomen. Her experience is totally free of suffering. And at one point, that wrenching in the abdomen becomes so intense that it threatens to capture all of her attention. And in what seems like a bold request, she says she wonders if the pain could possibly let up just a little bit. And with playful enthusiasm, she says, "You have only to ask," this voice says to her, and the pain instantly plummets to a much lower level. She says there's also pain in her neck as a catheter is being inserted into her right jugular vein and threaded toward her motionless heart. A sharper pain is also tugging at her attention, and the anesthesiologist is trying to insert a line in her right wrist, but the bloodless artery is collapsed, and he's having a terrible time doing it. She then suggests to the anesthesiologist mentally that he should try the larger, more proximal artery at the elbow. She senses his negative response as he shakes his head, and then she urges him again and again, and finally he does it, and he inserts it into the catheter, and everything is fine. She says then this white-haired surgeon enters the room looking very different from the rest. She says she actually sees a flame of white light seeming to blaze out of the top of his head and around his body, almost like an aura. And then the senior surgeon moves toward her with his unhurried, dignified grace, weaving a path through the crowded room. He comes to her right side, directly opposite him. He then intensely concentrates on his task as he is getting ready to try to save her life. He reaches into her abdomen and his hand disappears into the lake of blood. And she says, at that point, my point of view drops down and now I'm watching from inside my body. She says, the fingerprint whirls on the tips of his fingers are visible to her in exquisite detail. She says, wrapping his fingers around her aorta, he clamps the great aorta shut, cutting off the flow of the blood. And as he does that, he interrupts the hemorrhaging into the abdomen, redirects the blood back toward her system to the brain and the heart. She says the whole force of her awareness is gathered in his fist at the core of her body. And she says she feels the stab of pain far worse than anything before, but suddenly she also feels this explosion of white hot light all through her body, which tells her she's going to live. She says it's searingly hot, stunning and brilliant, and is absolutely a benevolent force. And as it streaks through her system, she says every level of her being feels loved, healed, and revitalized. She says when her consciousness then returns, she now sees she's stationed inside of her body, lying stunned on the operating table. And gratitude overflows toward everybody on the team. She then hears the voice of the elder surgeon, "Stop compressions." And she can feel a throbbing in her aorta, and everything falls silent. Everyone waits. Sure enough, 8 minutes after it stopped, her heart is beating again. And she says a few minutes later, one of the doctors leans over and whispers in her ear a message that fills her even with more joy. The doctor says, "You have a beautiful baby girl, and she's doing fine." She says later she awakens in the intensive care unit, surrounded by her husband and also a doctor and the whole team. And she still has a tracheal tube in her throat, so she can't speak, but she motions for something to write with. And she's given a napkin, and on it she writes words to this effect: "I know my uterus is out. I know my heart stopped, and I know I have a baby girl." She said at that point, she knew absolutely that consciousness is primary and that she is much more than her body or her mind. She says later she talked to all of the operation team afterwards, and they said it was impossible physiologically for her to know those things, and they couldn't explain it from a materialist physiological point of view. One of the things that happened as I was listening to her and then hearing also the transformation that happened in the rest of her life is I realized that NDEs are not only an amazing phenomenon that shows us that consciousness can survive lack of a heartbeat and a flatlined EEG, no brain activity, but they also serve to transform a person's life. And that's exactly what happened to her. She said when she woke up she knew that consciousness was primary. And she said that really began to change the whole direction of her life. What happened is she began to look for someone who might be a meditation teacher that could help her find her way back to that experience. And that actually happened to her later on in a meditation retreat with a meditation master. And she said once she was able to find her way back to that experience of this pure light and joy and ecstasy, this sense of oneness, she said she then shifted her career to one of hospice and end of life care because she said she now knew that people did not like go out of existence when they died. And she wanted them to be aware of that as self and be supported in that. And she said when she worked in hospice care, when she came into a room, the lack of fear of death that she had could be felt by everyone in it. And it gave people this sense of total equilibrium and in a sense of equanimity about the fact that life and death are part of this beautiful process, but we just transition to another realm of life on the other side. And so I should say, I mean, what that then had me doing is now doing more research to really understand the details of end of life experiences and to perhaps give more evidence to the scientific community and the community at large that this is actually verified scientific evidence, and we can show it time after time after time in carefully controlled studies. So the way we prove that it goes on is simply by doing prospective studies on near-death experiences in which there is cardiac arrest and the brain activity is flatlined. And there are a number of MDs at universities that have been doing this work for probably the last 20 or more years. One of them is Pim van Lommel in the Netherlands. He was part of a hospital network of about, I think, 10 different hospitals. And they created this prospective study. And by a prospective study, we mean a study that starts on a particular date, and they bring everybody into the study in that hospital network that has had cardiac arrest. And then they carefully record exactly what happens after the cardiac arrest. Do they have EEGs? Do they know the blood activity, the oxygen in the blood, et cetera? And they then ask the person, if they survive, what happened during your cardiac arrest and your state of, in effect, non-responsiveness to us. And about, I think it is 20% of the people say that they were aware, and about something like 12% say that they had a direct experience of being in the operating room, their awareness above the operating table, watching the resuscitation team, just like Bettina Payton did. And they give very accurate information about who was in the room, what they were wearing, what was being said, et cetera. All that can be verified by the team. And so when Pim van Lommel ended up finishing the study, he published it in the Lancet Journal, which is ranked number 2 out of, like, I think 150 or more journals in medicine. So it was peer-reviewed and it was accepted for publication. To me, that shows that the peers that were reviewing it also felt this was a very credible and carefully designed study. So that's just one of the many studies that's been done. Bruce Grayson has done a study on this. Penny Sartori is a nurse in the UK that has done another study. There are a number of studies. I think that, to me, there are enough studies now that we can't deny that this is a phenomenon. It doesn't happen with everyone, but it happens with perhaps maybe 10 to 12% of the people have this deeply aware experience of total consciousness, while there's no way their body can be considered functionally alive because the heart and the brain activity have stopped. One thing that a lot of people mention is that it may also be related to memory. And they say that there's something about a lot of situations where, for example, I mean, you even think about when we're dreaming at night, some of the people wake up and they have lucidity about everything that happened in the dream. And people like myself, we wake up and the dream is gone like that. I mean, it's like it's there for a second and then I can't remember a thing about it. And so a lot of it could be simply memory mechanisms, and we don't really understand what that is about. But it could be that others are having it and it just fades away before they ever come back to consciousness. I think it's a case that you can die from anything and have a near-death experience. And I think what's interesting is that we see it, of course, in cardiac arrest because that's the best way to study scientifically, because you know what the heart was doing, you know what the brain was doing, et cetera. But in fact, you find that a lot of people have near-death experiences actually when they are under anesthesia and something begins to go wrong, et cetera. and they may go into a coma, for example. The heart may be still beating, but they're in a coma, but they still come outside of their body and they're watching what is going on from above. I know there's a wonderful story of a woman in Germany who had a very, very severe set of burns when her whole body caught on fire. And she was, of course, taken into the ER, and she was in a coma for, I think, like about 9 days. And in fact, I think they even induced the continuing coma so that her body could heal without her having to be awake and experience the pain. And she said she would come and go in her awareness from her body in the operating room back to other realms as she was going through this whole process. So that's another example. Of course, we also hear about people who are in a car accident. And right when they have the impact of the car accident, they flip outside of their body and they're watching the resuscitation team come to go ahead and try to get the ambulance, get them into an ambulance. And sometimes their awareness follows the ambulance to the hospital. So as we say, there are many, many different examples. For example, if I were still wearing my materialist neuroscience hat, I would say, well, certainly there is evidence that there may be endorphins that might be released when you're close to the end of life, and maybe that is a evolutionary mechanism for allowing us not to feel the pain of death. That is one possibility from the materialist perspective. But when you hear about all of these experiences, the persons that I hear telling the stories don't have a sense of that. I mean, in fact, they move out of their body, and of course they don't feel any pain, but they definitely come back into the body, and then of course they feel all the pain again. There's no question about that. So I think that's a fascinating point, that pain is related to our awareness being inside of the pain receptors and the sensory perceptual systems of our body, and that's when we feel it so strongly. And once our awareness shifts to outside the body and we're watching it from outside, all the pain goes away. I'm part of a group of researchers, and I'll just name a few of them because I think these are outstanding researchers in the field. There is, in fact, Bruce Grayson, who is considered, like they think, the grandfather of NDE research. I'm from the University of Virginia. There is also Chris Rowe, who is at the University of Northampton in England, and of Nottingham in England, and he is doing a lot of research on paranormal phenomena like end-of-life experiences and after-death communication, near-death experiences. And then Michael Naum from Freiburg, Germany, a woman who is in fact a professor, an associate professor at Massey University in New Zealand, and is in fact a Maori by background, doing research on end-of-life experiences in Maori cultures, but in all cultures. And so we and others, Philip Roars is an MD at the University of Virginia in pediatric care, is one of our team members as well. Alan Kelleher, again, a number of people. Anyway, we have come together to try to look more carefully at terminal lucidity as one of those end-of-life experiences, to see whether one can say anything more about the nature of consciousness from looking at these particular studies in these cases. And we have just published our very first paper on 3 cases of terminal lucidity in children. And we have now a grant from the Bial Foundation to do this research. And I want to mention it because I'm hoping that your listeners might hear this, and I can give you afterwards a link where they could actually connect to a questionnaire if they know of someone who's had terminal lucidity or has observed terminal lucidity in a child or an adult. But I think the interesting thing in this case is that we have, in this case, 3 different children. And one child basically was born with immunological diseases. So they had real problems with immunological diseases since they were very, very young. And this was a 3-year-old young girl. And she'd had this diagnosis almost since she was born. And she'd had a year now of intense treatments. And she underwent, for example, an umbilical cord blood transplant, hoping that that might help her. That was the only known cure for this disease, but she ended up rejecting the transplant, which so often happens. And then she had to be readmitted to the hospital, and she was given chemotherapy and immunotherapy, but none of that seemed to work after just a few initial improvements. And so she was then transferred to this intensive care unit, and she was having pulmonary failure, liver failure, she was getting jaundice, etc. And she wasn't speaking, she wasn't eating, she was basically not responding to her parents or the providers. And so the providers said, this looks like she could have like a risk of what they call aspiration, like she begins to like actually have any water or food go into her lungs, and that would really be bad. And so they suggested that they go ahead and do a do not resuscitate, do not intubate procedure with the parents because they didn't want the child to really suffer. And the parents agreed to do that. And that evening, after they made that decision, they said the child awoke from all of this awful thing and asked for her usual comfort items. And those included things like a Lion King movie. She asked to see her parents and to play with her toys. And she asked for food as well, and she ate the food. And they said she showed no indication of any mental impairment. And she even regained the ability to sit up in bed, and she was coloring and doing other sorts of things that a child of that age would do. And they said she spoke with these perfectly organized full sentences. She had multiple conversations with her family during the evening, and she was noted by the bedside nurses having really had a miracle the way she was behaving. And interestingly, during the conversations with her parents, she reviewed all the important people in her life and she prayed for them. And they said she indicated this awareness of the fact that she was transitioning to death. And what she did, again, this is just a tiny kid, she reassured her family that there was no need to be concerned about her. And she also seemed to be talking to invisible people in the room that they noticed. And they said after several hours, she asked to go to bed. She returned to the comatose state. And over the next 24 to 48 hours, she never woke up again. And she died peacefully in her parents' arms. And so you hear those stories and you think, how could that be when she had been in such an impossible state ahead of time to wake up and be perfectly cogent and normal and then say goodbye to her parents and then die peacefully in their arms. And so we have two other cases like that that we have in this particular paper that is coming out in the Journal of Nervous and Mental Disease. And I think that we will now be collecting more as we have a questionnaire that is now online. And so I'm hoping what you can do is share that link with any viewers so that they, if they know of terminal lucidity in children or adults, they might be able to go to our link and actually fill out the questionnaire and give us more opportunities to find these cases and share them with others. What I would like to say to everyone is that being the neuroscientist and the materialist neuroscientist that I was before I had my own spiritual experience, I think that my main message that I want to give to other people like myself is that what I was lacking when I was a young professor in neuroscience was a curiosity about these phenomena. And I like to joke with my friends and my colleagues about what I call the eye rolling threshold. And when I was a young professor, I would roll my eyes at the idea that a near death experience could actually occur and that it could maybe be when there was cardiac arrest without brain activity. I would roll my eyes when somebody would say, well, you know, I heard my grandmother talking to me from the other side and she was saying certain things to me. I couldn't believe that that was possible. And therefore, I wouldn't go to the medical literature. For example, we have in the United States something called PubMed, which is this great database of all the research that's been done on medicine from many, many, many journals. And there are many journals that actually have near-death experience studies actually in them, published in them. I would never even look there because I knew it couldn't be true. So that was my eye rolling threshold being too high and my lack of curiosity keeping me from looking to see if there was evidence for that viewpoint. And I think my request to my colleagues and to other people around the world is if you're skeptical, skepticism is great, but then be also curious and go look at the literature and say, okay, what is the literature that says, is there evidence for consciousness existing when the brain is flatlined and the heart has stopped, or is there not? Can I look at that and then can I try to make my own, like, very careful evaluation and come to a conclusion that I feel good about from looking at the carefully performed literature? So I think that's the main lesson for me. And what I see is my eye rolling threshold has changed over the years. At first, I couldn't even look at NDEs. Then I couldn't look, for example, at after death communication. And then it's like, well, maybe I can't look at reincarnation. But then as I began doing research on things like reincarnation, meaning that I was going out there and reading all the papers that have been done by people like Ian Stevenson at the University of Virginia and others, I found that, wait a minute, there is an incredible amount of data about children that are, again, 2.5 to 3 years of age that say, excuse me, you're not my parents. My parents, would live in this other village. And then they go and they find in that other village that a child had died and that the parents he was talking about by name and identity actually still lived there because he died, a couple of years before. So I think that what I'm doing is I'm now excitedly exploring to see if I can now make a very careful judgment for myself about what I think is credible and what might not be credible. For me, what actually it is that it depends on how far it is outside of my own worldview. And I love that term worldview. So when I was the materialist neuroscientist, my worldview said brain creates consciousness, and that's it, because that's what most neuroscientists believe. And so near death experience was outside of that. And so I was rolling my eyes and I would not look at the literature because it couldn't be true. And I think what I find is that it depends on how far outside the edge of my worldview, the boundaries it is. And the second thing I've noticed is that if I have had an experience of something that is my own firsthand subjective experience, I'm more likely to believe it in somebody else. But when I was a young neuroscientist, I had never had any experience like that. And so to me, it was like it was impossible. I have five senses. My five senses are the only way of getting information from the universe. And that's all I knew about. And then once I had that awakening, I realized that there's another sense of knowing, of interconnection that we can have, that these people with NDEs have, people with after death communication from like a grandparent have, and they now have firsthand experience and now they're more willing to believe it in others because of that firsthand experience. I want to mention just one other thing too about why we don't do it, and that is that when I was a young neuroscientist and I didn't have tenure yet at the university, I knew that if I said anything about experiences like that, including my own meditation experience, and people heard that, I would lose my credibility with my colleagues at the university. And so I think that there are people like myself that are young assistant professors, they don't have tenure, and they keep those things totally to themselves. And they're skeptical a little because all of their colleagues are skeptical. And it's like we don't give ourselves a chance right now in this society because our scientific community tends to be so incredulous about something like that. And so I just encourage people to find places where they can actually share this. And I agree that if you don't have tenure, it can be hard. You want to be sure that you're credible and that you are accepted into the university community. And then you can go ahead and begin doing this research and speaking out more to other people about it. But that's a big issue. It's like we don't want to be excluded from what I would call like our university family, our university community. And I just want to give you one quick example, and that is another friend of mine from Tucson that had a near-death experience when she was a young woman. And when she came out of the experience, she had been in a coma for a while, and she was telling her parents and the hospital staff where she had been on the other side and all the things that had happened to her. And both the parents and the doctor said, stop talking about that. That was an illusion. That was a hallucination. And the doctor said, if you mention it to me one more time, I'm going to send you across the street to the psychiatric ward and they're going to give you medication. And of course, she stopped talking about it just like that. But it's like the world does not want to believe this. And so I'm going to keep it all to myself. And that's the sad thing, that doctors can't just say that was a beautiful experience without saying it was right or wrong or good or bad or real or not. Simon, so just knowing about Bettina Payton, whose story I told you, her husband was an atheist. They were both atheists before this happened. Both of them were MDs. After it, when she told the story to her husband, he said it was just a hallucination, forget about it. She couldn't forget about it. All of her doctor friends said they didn't understand it. They weren't necessarily just saying it was a hallucination. They said, but they couldn't explain that with flatline EEG, et cetera, that she could see everything. But the husband to this day, which is more than 20 years, probably 30 years later, still is an atheist. He has never been able to find her story credible enough that he would shift his worldview. So here she's had to fight that. Of course, she's found her own community in the meantime, people like myself who love to hear her own experience. But I think that that tells us that it's more than just whether you have a community. I think if you have the community that's negative, they can certainly make you skeptical of whether it was a real experience or not. One thing I want to say is that a book that I've just recently published and edited along with David Lorimer is a book called Spiritual Awakenings: Scientists and Academics Describe Their Experiences. And what we did was we went to academics and scientists and said, if you have had an awakening, would you be willing to share that awakening with us, what it was like, and how that transformed your life? And I found that it was beautiful to actually receive those essays and then publish them, because these people were often saying, we've never even shared this before in our life, because there was no appropriate outlet for sharing this. And finally, they could share this with another group. And it's again in this book that I think people would highly enjoy. They're like, each one of the essays is about 4 pages each. And I think our conclusion from that book is we need to find a way in academic and scientific communities to make it acceptable for people to share these experiences so that we can see how widespread they really are.